It all began with uncertainty hanging in the air like a heavy storm cloud. The kind that doesn't thunder right away but builds pressure quietly, minute by minute, until something inside you starts to ache. Amy sat in silence, her mind spinning faster than she could catch up with it. The courthouse loomed ahead, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't know what waited for her inside. It wasn't just a hearing, it was Judgment Day in more ways than one. For weeks, rumors had swirled, stories spreading online faster than she could deny them. People talked, speculated, twisted every word she said into something new. Fans were divided, some defended her, others turned cold. But none of that mattered now. This moment wasn't about the internet or TV or fame. It was about her children. It was about whether she'd walk out that door still being their mother in every way that mattered. She took a deep breath, hoping the judge would see the real her. The version that wasn't edited for television or blown out of proportion on social media. She wanted someone, anyone, to understand that she had made mistakes, but she was still fighting. She had changed more than anyone could see from the outside. But as she sat waiting, fear crept into every corner of her mind. Because no matter how much she told herself she was ready, there was a part of her that wasn't sure if redemption was even possible. Every tick of the clock echoed louder than the last. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, but to Amy, it felt like a place where dreams either lived or died. She glanced around at the faces in the room, some sympathetic, some cold, others just curious. To them, this was just another day, another case. But to her, it was everything. Behind the walls of that courtroom was a lifetime of pressure, decisions, and consequences. The cameras might have stopped rolling, but the judgment of strangers never really did. Every headline, every video, every hateful comment still echoed in her mind. And in that moment, she realized that this wasn't just a legal hearing. It was a mirror. One that forced her to face everything she had tried to outrun. She could still remember how things used to be. The laughter, the chaos, the love that once filled her home. Before everything got so complicated. Before fame magnified every fight, every tear, every ounce of pain. Back then, she never imagined it would come to this. But life had a way of turning even the strongest people into versions of themselves they didn't recognize. Outside the courthouse, the world moved on. Cars passed, people walked, and nobody knew the weight of the moment unfolding behind those doors. For Amy, time had slowed to a crawl. She kept replaying her past decisions in her head. Every argument, every mistake. Every time she thought she was doing the right thing but ended up hurting someone she loved. She remembered the nights of silence after the cameras stopped filming. When the laughter faded and all that remained were echoes of what used to be. The fame that once seemed like a blessing had turned into a curse. It magnified every crack, every flaw, until there was nowhere left to hide. And yet, even in the chaos, she had tried to hold on. To her kids, to herself, to some sense of normalcy. But things had fallen apart faster than she could put them back together. The hardest part wasn't losing control. It was realizing she might not get the chance to prove she could fix it. The air inside the courthouse felt colder than outside. Maybe it was the nerves, or maybe it was the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. The security officer called her name and suddenly everything inside her froze. This was it. No turning back. No more maybe next time. She rose to her feet, feeling every ounce of tension she'd tried to bury. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to steady them. The hallway to the courtroom felt longer than it should have, each step echoing like a countdown. Behind her, whispers floated through the air, half pity, half curiosity. People always wanted to see how a story ended, especially when it wasn't theirs. Amy had faced cameras, critics, and chaos before, but this was different. There were no retakes, no editing. Whatever happened next would be real and permanent. She thought about her kids, about how their laughter used to fill the house, how their tiny hands used to reach for her without hesitation. That memory hit harder than anything else. Because for all the noise, all the drama, all the mistakes, she had always loved them more than anything. And now, love alone might not be enough to save her. The doors to the courtroom opened, and the world seemed to fall silent. Her breath caught in her chest as she stepped inside. Every movement, every sound felt magnified. The creak of the wooden benches, the shuffle of papers, the distant cough from the back of the room, it all blurred together into one overwhelming wave. She looked up at the judge, trying to read his expression, but it was impossible. His face was unreadable, calm, detached, That's what scared her most, the lack of emotion. Because she needed him to see her as a person, not a headline. Not a character from a TV show. She wanted to speak, to explain everything, to show how much she had grown since the last time the world had seen her fall apart. But words didn't come easily when your heart was on the line. All she could do was breathe and hope. The judge's gavel hit the desk and the sound cut through the room like thunder. It was official. Whatever happened next was no longer in her hands. In that single moment, Amy realized something she hadn't before. No matter what anyone said, no matter how the story unfolded, this was still her life. Her mistakes didn't define her, and neither would the outcome of this hearing. Because deep down she knew that surviving wasn't about winning, it was about enduring. And as she stood there, surrounded by strangers and judgment, she decided something quietly inside herself. No matter how hard this got, no matter how much people doubted her, she would keep fighting. For her children, for her name, for herself, the world could twist her story. The internet could mock her pain, but they could never understand what it took just to stand there. To face the truth. To face herself. And as the courtroom fell into silence again, Amy felt the weight of everything pressing down on her, and somehow she found the strength to keep standing. Because sometimes the greatest fight isn't the one in front of others. It's the one inside you. The courtroom was silent, but the silence wasn't calm. It was heavy, thick, almost alive. Every sound cut through it like glass breaking. The rustle of papers, the squeak of a chair, the faint hum of the air conditioner that suddenly felt too loud. Amy stood there, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She tried to look steady, but inside she was unraveling. The judge began speaking, his voice even and controlled, words falling like stones into still water. He wasn't angry. He wasn't kind. He was measured, the kind of tone that didn't give anything away. Amy focused on the rhythm of his words, but meaning slipped away from her as her mind spun. All she could think about were the months that led to this. The sleepless nights, the headlines, the endless noise from people who thought they knew her story. Behind her, she could feel eyes watching. Some sympathetic, some cold, some just curious. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Maybe some were rooting for her redemption. Maybe others were waiting for her downfall. But none of them really knew what it had taken to get here. The weight of healing while the world watched. The exhaustion of trying to rebuild while strangers judged every move. The judge's words grew sharper, cutting through her thoughts. He spoke about responsibility, about choices, about consequences. Amy nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. She knew all of that already. She had lived every consequence in real time. Every mistake dissected by millions of people who didn't know the whole truth. Her lawyer glanced at her. Giving a small nod meant to reassure, but it barely reached her. The courtroom light hit her face and she realized her hands were trembling again. She clasped them together tightly, forcing them still. There was no room for weakness here. No space for tears. Not now. The judge paused, flipping through the case file, his fingers brushing over the papers that held her future. Amy tried to breathe normally, but every inhale felt like she was swallowing air that was too thick to get down. She thought about her children again, the way their eyes looked when they laughed, the tiny sound of their voices calling her name. She thought about how many nights she had whispered promises to herself, that she'd get better, that she'd fight for them, that she'd never stop trying. The courtroom clock ticked, and every second felt like it dragged out longer than the last. Her mind replayed moments she wished she could change, times she'd let anger win, times she'd shut people out, times she'd believed she was too far gone to be fixed. Then the judge spoke again, this time about progress. About effort. About the fact that people can change, but change takes more than words. Amy's breath hitched. For a split second, she felt hope flicker. Small, fragile, but real. He talked about accountability, about the future, about giving someone a chance when they prove they're willing to fight for it. Amy held on to those words like a rope, because that was all she had, the fight. Fight. When the judge finally announced his decision, the words didn't hit her all at once. They came slowly, almost unreal. She had been given another chance, but it came with conditions, with expectations, with the weight of proving herself day after day. It wasn't freedom, it was responsibility. But to Amy, it felt like oxygen. For the first time in weeks, she exhaled fully. The sound was almost a sigh, almost a cry, but mostly relief. The kind that comes when you've been holding your breath for too long. The courtroom shifted as the gavel came down again, and just like that, it was over. People began to stand, whispering quietly as they gathered their things. Amy stayed still, absorbing the reality that the moment she'd been terrified of had passed, and she was still standing. Outside, the sunlight hit her face, and it felt foreign after the cold air of the courtroom. The brightness made her squint, but she didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like harsh light. It felt like possibility. The cameras were waiting, of course. They always were. But Amy didn't rush to them. She stood there for a moment, grounding herself. The chaos of the world could wait. Right now, she needed to feel this. The strange mix of relief, fear, and quiet determination that pulsed through her chest. She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't the end of her battles. It was just another beginning. The internet would still talk. The critics would still pick her apart. But none of them could take away what had just happened inside that courtroom. The proof that she still had a path forward. As she walked down the courthouse steps, flashes from cameras burst around her, but she didn't flinch. Each click of a shutter sounded like a reminder of how far she'd come. There was a time when that noise would have broken her, made her hide, made her crumble. But not anymore. She had learned something in all of this. Pain doesn't disappear when the cameras stop. Healing isn't instant and redemption isn't glamorous. It's slow, quiet, and messy, but it's real. And that's what she wanted now. Something real. The car door closed behind her, muffling the outside world, and for the first time all day, she let her shoulders fall. Her hands shook, but this time it wasn't fear. It was release. She had survived the worst part, and now came the harder one, living up to the second chance she'd just been given. The drive home felt endless. The scenery passed by like a blur of memories. Places she used to visit, roads she'd driven countless times before, now carrying the weight of everything that had changed. Somewhere between the courthouse and her front door, she felt something new take root. Not confidence, not peace, but resolve. When she finally reached home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that reminded her of everything she'd lost along the way. But she didn't let it swallow her. Instead, she walked through each room slowly, touching familiar things, letting the reality of being back sink in. Every photo, every corner, every memory carried a story. Some painful, some sweet. She saw the toys her kids used to play with, the faint marks on the walls where little hands had drawn. The reminders of what she was still fighting for surrounded her. As the afternoon faded into evening, Amy sat down by the window and watched the light shift across the floor. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The tears would come later, maybe in the quiet hours of the night when the weight of everything finally caught up to her. For now, she just breathed. Steady, deep, alive. The world outside kept moving, cars passing, dogs barking, life continuing. And for once, she didn't feel like she was chasing it. She was part of it again. And that small realization felt like victory. She thought about the people who'd supported her, the ones who hadn't given up when everyone else did. She thought about her sister, about how complicated their bond had become, full of love, anger, forgiveness, and all the things that come with family. Maybe someday they'd rebuild that too, but for now, one step at a time was enough. The sky darkened, the first stars faintly visible, and Amy whispered a small promise to herself. That this time she wouldn't let the noise drown her out, that this second chance wouldn't go to waste, because she had finally realized that redemption doesn't come when the world forgives you. It comes when you start forgiving yourself, and somewhere deep inside, beneath all the scars and the headlines, Amy knew this was the beginning of something new. The first night back home didn't feel like victory. It felt like aftermath. The air inside the house was still, and even though the lights were on, everything seemed dimmer somehow. Amy sat at the edge of her bed for a long time, still wearing the same clothes she'd worn to court. The weight of the day pressed against her chest. She looked around the room, half-packed boxes, folded clothes, a blanket tossed carelessly across the floor. Everything looked like a snapshot of a life that had been paused mid-motion. That's what it felt like lately, a life waiting for permission to start again. Outside, crickets hummed. The world was moving as usual, but inside her house, time stretched thin. She tried turning on the TV for noise, but the sound of cheerful hosts and commercials felt too far removed from reality. She turned it off again. For a moment, she just listened. To the faint hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the house settling, the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. It was the first real silence she'd had in months, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt uncertain, like the world was asking her, now what? She thought about the judge's words, how he'd emphasized that change had to be proven, lived, not just promised. That stuck with her. Promises had always been easy. Living them was harder. She'd promised to do better so many times before, and every time she stumbled, the world was there to watch her fall. This time had to be different. She reached for her phone out of habit, scrolling through endless messages, news notifications, social media mentions, text messages from friends who'd watched the case unfold. Some were supportive, others judgmental. She closed them all. The noise could wait. She needed to breathe first. When she finally lay down, sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, flashes of the courtroom returned. The gavel, the stillness, the moment her name was called. Her mind replayed it over and over until exhaustion finally won. Morning came with pale sunlight seeping through the curtains. For the first time in a long time, there were no calls to film, no producers asking for updates, no schedule to follow. Just her and the quiet. She made coffee not because she wanted it, but because the ritual felt normal. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar, and for a moment, it grounded her. As she sipped, she glanced at the refrigerator door. Photos were pinned beneath magnets, her kids smiling, birthdays, moments that felt like another lifetime. She stared at them longer than she meant to, the ache in her chest growing heavier. Everything she had done, every mistake and every apology, circled back to those faces. She whispered under her breath, barely audible, a simple sentence that felt more like a vow. I'm not giving up. The day stretched slow. She cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, organized drawers, small acts that didn't fix anything but helped her feel like she had some control. Every dish she washed, every shirt she folded, felt symbolic, like she was scrubbing away the chaos of the past few months one piece at a time. When she finally stepped outside, the world looked normal again. The sun was warm, kids were playing somewhere down the street, birds chattered in the distance. It was the kind of day that used to slip by unnoticed. Now it felt like a reminder that life still existed beyond the storm. She walked to the mailbox, the gravel crunching under her shoes, and realized how long it had been since she'd done something so simple. Most of the envelopes were bills or promotional flyers, but one caught her attention, a handwritten letter. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike. Her breath caught. It was from one of her fans, someone who'd followed her journey from the very beginning. The letter was short, filled with words of encouragement, saying how proud they were of her for standing tall, for not giving up. It wasn't long or poetic, but it hit harder than anything else could have. Because somewhere out there, someone still believed in her. She held that letter for a long time, staring at the words, letting them sink in. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she felt. Later that afternoon, she drove to the park where she used to take her kids. It was quiet, just the sound of wind in the trees and the distant laughter of a few families. She sat on a bench watching them play, imagining her children there with her again. It wasn't the same without them, but it gave her hope. One day, she thought. One day soon. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. For a moment, Amy felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. Not the kind that comes from fixing everything, but the kind that comes from finally accepting where you are. She realized healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, learning from it, letting it shape you into someone stronger. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The next few days passed slowly but steadily. She began building small routines, morning walks, journaling, cooking healthy meals. They weren't glamorous changes, but they were real. Every step, every small act felt like proof that she was moving forward, even if no one else noticed. Sometimes she'd glance at social media again, scrolling through headlines about her, seeing how people interpreted her story. But the sting wasn't as sharp anymore. Let them talk. She knew the truth. At night, she'd sit by the same window as before, watching the sky darken, feeling the stillness settle around her. The loneliness still hurt, but it didn't consume her anymore. Instead, it became fuel, proof that she could stand on her own. One evening, as rain began to fall softly outside, Amy picked up her phone and opened a blank note. For the first time in months, she started writing. Not for the show, not for anyone else, just for herself. She wrote about everything. The fear, the regret, the hope, the moments that nearly broke her. The words poured out faster than she expected, like they'd been waiting for release. When she finished, she read it back and realized something. She wasn't the same person who'd walked into that courtroom. That version of her had been scared, desperate for validation. The woman sitting here now was still flawed, still hurting, but she was aware. And that awareness felt like power. Weeks passed. Slowly, things began to shift. Her interactions with family grew calmer, more understanding. There were still tense moments, still old wounds that hadn't fully healed, but progress was visible. Small steps. She began meeting with a counselor, working through emotions she'd buried for years. At first, it was uncomfortable, facing everything head-on. But over time, she began to understand herself better. The triggers, the fears, the patterns. It wasn't about finding quick solutions. It was about breaking the cycle. Sometimes she'd walk past mirrors and catch her reflection. Tired eyes, faded makeup, but a different kind of strength there now. The kind that comes from surviving when you didn't think you could. One evening, she received a message that stopped her cold. It was from someone she hadn't spoken to in months, a family member reaching out, simply saying they'd seen her progress and were proud of her. The words were simple, but they cracked something open inside her. She realized that rebuilding wasn't just about her, it was about showing others that it was possible. That even after everything fell apart, you could still stand again. By the time the month ended, the house didn't feel empty anymore. It wasn't full of noise or people, it was full of purpose. The air felt lighter. The walls didn't echo quite as much. And when she looked in the mirror that morning, she didn't see failure. She saw someone in progress. The world still talked. The gossip didn't stop. But Amy had changed the way she listened. The opinions of strangers no longer dictated her worth. She was starting to live for herself again, and as the camera of the world slowly shifted away from her story, she found comfort in the quiet. Because sometimes the best part of redemption is when no one's watching. The days had finally started to feel normal again. Not perfect, not healed, but normal. That quiet rhythm where the coffee tastes the same every morning, where you can predict the sound of the mail truck and know which floorboard creaks when you walk down the hall. Amy had grown used to the peace, even if it felt temporary. For a few weeks, she believed maybe the world had stopped watching. Maybe she could just live quietly and figure things out. But peace never stays for long. Not in her world. It started small. A message, a rumor, a phone call she didn't expect. Her lawyer again. His voice was calm, but his words weren't. There was another hearing coming up. A follow-up, he called it, just a procedural check-in. But the moment he said the word court, her chest tightened again like it had that first day. She'd been pretending that chapter was closed. She'd packed it up neatly in the back of her mind, labeled it done. But life has a way of reopening old wounds just when you start to forget where they were. That night, she sat in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed. The clock ticked loud enough to fill the silence. She kept replaying what her lawyer said, how these hearings could go either way depending on the judge's mood, how one wrong word could change everything again. Her coffee had gone cold, but she still held it, staring at the swirl of cream floating on top. She whispered under her breath, "Not again. Please, not again." The next morning came like a fog. She didn't even remember falling asleep. She looked in the mirror and saw the same tired face, the same eyes that had carried too much worry for too long. But there was something different this time, a kind of determination that hadn't been there before. She wasn't the same woman who'd walked into that courthouse months ago. She'd survived that, learned from it, changed because of it. She promised herself she wouldn't let fear win again. So she started preparing. She gathered every document, every letter of support, every proof that she was doing better. Counseling records, receipts, photos with her kids, everything that showed progress. And she made a vow. She'd walk into that courtroom with her head high this time. No tears, no shaking. Just truth. Her family was quieter now. Less judgmental, more careful with their words. Maybe they'd seen her change, or maybe they were just tired of fighting. Either way, the house didn't echo with arguments anymore. And that alone was progress. Still, not everyone understood her. There were whispers about her relationship, her choices, her plans. Some people said she was rushing again, that she hadn't learned her lesson. Others said she was finally figuring herself out. But opinions didn't matter as much now. What mattered was showing her kids the version of their mother who refused to quit. The morning of the new hearing came quietly. No cameras, no crowds, just her standing in front of the mirror, adjusting her jacket. She took one last deep breath before stepping outside. The sky was gray, heavy clouds rolling low, threatening rain. Fitting, she thought. The kind of weather that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The courthouse loomed in the distance, the same one that had haunted her dreams. But this time it didn't look as big. Maybe she'd just grown stronger. When she stepped through those glass doors, she could smell the same blend of cleaning chemicals and old paper. The sound of shoes echoing on tile. The same security guards nodded at her. They remembered her. Back again? One of them asked softly. She just smiled. Yeah, but not for long. Inside, her lawyer gave her a reassuring look. He whispered, "You've been doing good. Just tell the truth. Let your progress speak for itself." So she did. When her name was called, she walked forward, calm, steady. She spoke about her counseling sessions, about her plans for her kids, about the small victories that no one saw, the quiet nights without panic, the mornings spent reading instead of crying. The judge listened. No expression. Just the sound of papers shuffling and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Then came that long silence, the kind that could stretch for miles. Finally, the judge leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "I can see the effort," he said slowly. "But effort isn't the same as change. Keep proving it." Then came the words she'd been afraid to hear, another continuation. 30 more days. It wasn't what she'd hoped for. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't punishment either. It was another chance. When she stepped outside, the rain had started. Light at first, then heavier. She didn't run. She let it fall. The cold drops slid down her face, and for a second she couldn't tell if she was crying or just wet. But then she laughed. Quiet. Almost bitter. 30 more days, she whispered to herself. Fine. I've done worse. She got into her car and sat there for a long time watching the rain streak down the windshield. And slowly she started to smile. Because for the first time, she realized she wasn't scared of time anymore. Time meant another chance to get it right. That night, she called her sister. The conversation started awkward, the way it always did. Small talk, jokes, sideways concern. But eventually, Amy just said it. "I'm tired of surviving. I want to live." Her sister was quiet for a moment before saying, "Then do it. Live. Just do it right this time." And Amy promised she would. Over the next few weeks, she did just that. She started fixing the house, little things first. New curtains, new paint, new memories. She began working on her fitness again, not because of the cameras, but because she wanted to feel strong. She cooked, she cleaned, she played with her boys. The world might have seen a woman in limbo, waiting for a verdict. But inside that home, she was already rebuilding. There were nights she still felt the weight of it all. Guilt, shame, doubt. But those feelings didn't control her anymore. They just reminded her how far she'd come. Every sunrise felt like a quiet victory. Every bedtime kiss for her boys felt like proof that she was still fighting. One evening, she took a walk by herself. The streets were quiet, the air cool, and the world seemed softer than usual. She looked up at the sky, the stars barely visible through the haze, and said to herself, "I'm still here." And for once, that felt like enough. The camera of life had shifted again, away from chaos and into something gentler, something slower. The noise of the world faded. What remained was a woman learning, growing, forgiving, because redemption isn't a headline. It's the small, silent moments no one else sees. And Amy was finally living them. 30 days. That's all she was given. A single month to prove herself. To keep walking the tightrope between what she'd been and what she was becoming. At first, she marked every day on a small calendar hanging beside her fridge. Red X's one by one. But halfway through the month, she stopped counting. Because something had shifted. She wasn't waiting anymore, she was living. Those 30 days weren't a sentence. They were a mirror. Every morning, she looked into it and saw someone she hadn't recognized in a long time. Steady, calm, a little bit stronger than yesterday. The house that once echoed with chaos now hummed with quiet purpose. The boys laughed again, the kind of laughter that fills every corner and makes you forget how heavy the world can be. There were still moments of tension, small fights, messy days, but they felt human now, not hopeless. And through it all, Amy kept a small note taped above her mirror. Prove it, not to them, to yourself. She did. Every single day. She started walking every morning, even when the sky was gray and cold. She'd put on her hoodie, plug in her earphones, and just go. The first few days, her legs hurt. Her chest burned. But the pain felt like progress. She kept telling herself, one step closer to the life I deserve. Some days she'd run into people, neighbors, old friends, who'd heard things, read things, whispered things. But she didn't flinch anymore, because the truth was simpler now. She knew who she was. She didn't need the world to remind her. The final week came faster than she expected. Suddenly, the X's on the calendar were almost gone. And with each one, she realized how much lighter she felt. This wasn't the same fear she had before the first court day. This was something different. Calm. Prepared. The night before her last hearing, she couldn't sleep. Not because she was scared, but because she finally understood what all of this had meant. It wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about forgiveness. It was about accountability, the kind that changes you from the inside out. She sat in bed, the glow of her phone screen lighting her face as she scrolled through old photos, her kids, the show, the memories, the mistakes. It was all part of her story now. And for the first time, she didn't wish she could erase any of it. She just wanted to keep writing new chapters. Morning came slow and heavy with rain again, almost poetic. She drove to the courthouse alone. No cameras. No distractions. Just her and the sound of rain tapping on the windshield. When she stepped inside, it felt familiar, but it didn't scare her this time. Her lawyer smiled when he saw her. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded. More than ever. When her name was called, she stood up, walked to the front, and faced the same judge who had seen her break before. This time, her voice didn't shake. She spoke clearly, honestly, not rehearsed, not desperate. Just real. She talked about her progress, about her counseling, about her boys, about the small victories that no one clapped for but mattered most. The courtroom was silent when she finished. The judge leaned back, studying her like he was seeing a different person entirely. Then, with a slow nod, he said the words she'd been waiting for. Case closed. 2 words. That's all it took. But in those 2 words, she heard everything. Freedom, peace, and a quiet kind of victory that didn't need applause. She thanked the court, turned, and walked out. Her lawyer said something about paperwork, but she barely heard him. The sound of her own heartbeat drowned everything else out. When she pushed open the courthouse doors, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, sunlight pushing through, soft, golden, almost symbolic. She stood there for a long moment, letting the breeze hit her face. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. Not for a camera, not for anyone watching, but for herself. No one would ever fully understand what those months had taken out of her. No one could see the invisible battles, the nights she couldn't sleep, the mornings she forced herself to try again, the times she almost gave up but didn't. But maybe they didn't need to, because healing isn't about proving you're perfect. It's about proving you're trying. She drove home with the windows down, letting the air rush in. The road stretched ahead, open, endless. When she pulled into her driveway, her boys came running to the door. "Mom!" they shouted, laughing. That sound, their laughter, was her verdict. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Amy sat outside on the porch. The air smelled like rain and earth. The world felt clean again. She thought about everything, the judge, the noise, the past. And quietly she whispered, "It's over." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't really over. It was just beginning, a new chapter. One not written by fear or judgment or the weight of mistakes. One written by resilience, by love, by second chances, She wasn't the same woman she'd been at the start of this story. She wasn't the scared, trembling figure walking into a courtroom begging for mercy. She was something else now, something stronger. She'd earned her peace. And as the night settled in, Amy took one last deep breath, looked up at the stars breaking through the dark, and said softly to herself, "I made it." The world outside moved on, as it always does. But for Amy, time stood still, just long enough to feel the full weight of what she'd survived, and the quiet promise of everything still to come.